In the punishing summer of 2009, 26-year-old Maren Voss inherited three things from her grandmother: a farmhouse with a roof that leaked in two places, a John Deere tractor that burned more oil than fuel, and 240 acres of Georgia red clay that hadn't produced a meaningful harvest in nearly a decade. She also inherited the debt. It wasn't catastrophic by the standards of some farms she'd heard about, the ones that went under overnight like a boat with a hole no one had bothered to patch. But it was steady and patient, the kind of debt that sat across the table from you every morning, like an unwanted guest who knew he wasn't leaving. Her grandmother, Iris Voss, had farmed this land for 50 years with her husband, and after he passed, she'd kept it going through sheer stubborn love. But love doesn't fix depleted soil, and it doesn't pay the note at the bank either. When Iris died in March of that year, the land she left behind was pale and hard, the topsoil thin as paper, the earth below it the color of old brick. The last tenant farmer who'd worked it had planted corn 3 seasons in a row, stripped what little nitrogen remained, and quietly let his lease expire without telling anyone why. Maren had grown up visiting this farm every summer as a girl. She remembered it differently. She remembered the smell of it after rain, something dark and alive, the way the garden behind the house would erupt every July, with tomatoes so heavy they bent the cages sideways. She remembered following her grandmother along the fence rows in the early morning, dew still on the grass, Iris pointing out the red-tailed hawk that nested in the old oak at the property's edge and telling her, without any particular emphasis, that a farm with hawks was a farm with balance. Now there were no hawks. There was no garden. There was just the clay and the debt and a stack of her grandmother's composition notebooks that Maren found in the drawer of the old roll-top desk in the front room. She almost didn't read them. She was a landscape architect by training, not a farmer. She had a studio apartment in Atlanta and a job she was good at and a life that, while not exactly thriving, was at least predictable. The sensible thing, the thing every person she trusted told her to do, was to list the property with a real estate agent and let it go. Her cousin said it. Her friend from college said it. The estate attorney said it with a particular kind of professional gentleness that made her feel like a child being talked out of keeping a stray dog. But she read the notebooks anyway. Iris Voss had kept records the way some people keep diaries, not just what she planted and when, but what she noticed. The color of the water in the drainage ditch along the south field after a heavy rain. The way earthworms appeared in the soil near the old compost pile, but vanished 10 yards out. The year she'd stopped seeing fireflies in the east pasture, and what she'd changed about her spray schedule the season before. She was not a scientist. She had 2 years of community college and a lifetime of paying attention. But across 30 years of notebooks, she had assembled a portrait of a farm as a living system, one that rewarded observation and punished shortcuts. Near the back of the last notebook, dated 2006, 3 years before she died, Iris had written a short paragraph in her careful, slanted hand. The soil out by the creek feeder doesn't need more fertilizer. It needs more life. The microbes are what's missing. Something has to bring them back. I think it starts with the water. She had underlined that last sentence twice. Maren stood in the kitchen, reading that paragraph for a long time. Then she drove to the county extension office. The man behind the desk was Mr. Caldwell, the district agricultural agent, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with the particular confidence of someone who has given the same advice for 20 years and has never had much reason to question it. He pulled up the soil test results from the previous owner on his computer, scrolled through them with mild interest, and told Maren what she had already suspected. The land was matter below 1%, nitrogen essentially non-existent, microbial activity In his words, negligible. She asked him what he recommended. He recommended a synthetic fertilizer program. 3 applications of a nitrogen-phosphorus-potassium blend across the growing season, starting immediately. He had the names of 2 suppliers he trusted. He could put her in touch with both. At current prices, she was looking at roughly $11,000 for the first year, possibly more depending on what she decided to plant. She asked if there was another way. He looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has heard this question before. "Miss Voss," he said, "I understand you might be looking for something more natural, but we're talking about commercial agriculture, not a backyard garden. This land has been stripped. You can't coax it back with compost tea and good intentions. You need inputs, real inputs. The biology you're talking about, the microbes, they don't come back on their own when the soil is this far gone. You have to force it." She thanked him and drove home. What she did next was not what anyone expected. Maren had noticed something on one of her first walks around the property. Running along the western edge of the farm was a drainage ditch, maybe 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep in most places, fed by a small seasonal creek that came down off the neighboring rise. For most of the year it held water, slow and stagnant, warm in summer, smelling faintly of mud and decay. 3 smaller ditches branched off it and ran between the fields, the same system her grandmother's husband had dug by hand 60 years ago to irrigate the low sections of the property. The water in those ditches was dead, not literally, but ecologically. There was no movement, no oxygen, no cycle. Whatever fell in it rotted slowly and went nowhere. She'd spent a year in her graduate program, studying constructed wetlands and bioswales. The way moving water, even barely moving water, changed everything about what could live in it. She'd written a thesis section on the role of riparian vegetation in reintroducing beneficial microorganisms to degraded soils. She had never applied any of it to a farm. She wasn't sure anyone had, not exactly like this. She used the last of her savings and the small amount her grandmother had left in a checking account, about $4,000 in total. And she did 2 things. First, she drove to a tilapia farm an hour and a half south of her property and bought 300 juvenile fish. They were cheap, hardy, and in water above 60 degrees, nearly impossible to kill. She loaded them in a transport tank in the bed of the pickup and drove home slowly, taking the back roads, and released them into the main ditch along the western edge of the property. They scattered into the murky water and disappeared. Second, she used the remaining money to rent a small excavator for 2 days and reshape the ditch system. She didn't deepen it or widen it. She added 3 small weirs, low rock and clay berms placed at intervals to slow the water and force it to spread before it continued downstream. The effect was to create a gentle, continuous movement throughout the system. Not a current exactly, but a slow pulse like breathing. She seeded the ditch banks with native sedge and rush grass. She planted 2 small stands of cattail at the intake points. Then she waited. Her neighbor to the north was a man named Mr. Hendricks, who had farmed the adjacent 400 acres of soybeans and corn with consistent results for going on 30 years. He was not unkind. He was the kind of man who brought over a pound of coffee when someone new moved in, and meant it sincerely, who would fix your fence if he accidentally knocked it down before you noticed. But he was also deeply, structurally certain about how farming worked. He stopped by one afternoon in late July, leaned against the fence at the edge of her south field, and watched her wading in the ditch with a net, removing excess fish to keep the population balanced. He didn't say anything at first, just watched. Then, "What are you doing with the fish?" she explained briefly. "The circulation, the bacterial cycle, the nitrogen, how the water moving through the ditch would pick up the waste from the fish, The ammonia would be converted by naturally occurring bacteria, first to nitrite and then to nitrate, and the nitrate would ride the irrigation water out into the fields when she opened the head gates. Mr. Hendricks listened. He was quiet for a moment. "That's aquaponics," he said. "That's a greenhouse thing. That's not how fields work." She told him she thought it might be, actually. He shook his head slowly, not meanly, the way a person shakes their head at the weather. Then he climbed back on his tractor and drove down the row. The story got around. Small farming communities operate the way small towns always have, through the currency of other people's decisions, and Marin's decision was unusual enough to generate conversation. She heard it secondhand. The Voss girl was trying to fertilize her fields with fish water. Nobody said it viciously. It was more like bewilderment, a curiosity, the way people talk about someone who has started doing something harmlessly eccentric that they don't entirely understand. Let me ask you something. Have you ever staked something real on a conviction that you couldn't fully prove yet? Not a hunch exactly, something more solid than that, but still short of certainty. Something you believed in the marrow of your bones, even while you couldn't find the right words to defend it at the kitchen table. That was where Marin stood in the fall of 2009, with a ditch full of fish and fields full of red clay, and exactly no one in her corner. The notebooks were her only evidence. Her grandmother's attention was her only inheritance that mattered. The formal challenge came in October, when a sales representative from a regional agricultural supply company appeared at her door. His name was Mr. Greer, and he had the smooth, purposeful energy of a man who had closed a great many deals by making people feel that their hesitation was the problem, and his product was the solution. He'd heard about her situation, he said. The inherited debt, the depleted soil, the approaching winter with no harvest in sight. He was sympathetic, genuinely sympathetic. He wanted her to know. He had a proposal. His company was running a promotional program for first-year farm operators. Full fertilizer package, soil amendment starter kit, extended payment terms. She wouldn't owe anything until after the first harvest. He could have product delivered within the week. He stood in her driveway in pressed khakis and boat shoes that had never seen actual water, and he told her that what she was doing, the fish, the wetland planting, all of it, was interesting, but interesting didn't pay the note. Interesting didn't produce a yield. He had seen farmers try creative approaches before. They were inspiring people. They just often ended up selling their land to someone more practical. Marin listened to all of it. She stood with her arms folded, not defensively, just still, the way she'd learned to stand when someone was talking at her rather than to her. "Mr. Greer," she said, "my grandmother paid off this land." Then she watched it get stripped by someone who used exactly your program. "I'm not interested in inheriting that problem twice." He smiled, the particular smile of someone recalibrating their approach. He left her with a brochure and a business card, and the parting suggestion that she call him when she'd had time to think it over. She put both in the recycling bin before she reached the porch steps. Now let me tell you what was actually happening in that ditch, because it matters, and because the people who later dismissed what Marin accomplished never fully understood it. Tilapia are extraordinarily efficient converters of organic material into waste, which sounds like a liability, but is in fact the entire point. Their ammonia-rich excretions, combined with the decomposing plant matter that falls into a water system, create the exact conditions that aerobic bacteria need to thrive. Aerobic bacteria require oxygen. In a stagnant ditch, there is almost none, but in a ditch with gentle, continuous movement, even the slow pulse that Marin had created with her weirs, oxygen is distributed throughout the water column. The bacteria colonize the submerged roots of the sedge and rush grass, which provide ideal surface area. They process the ammonia through the nitrification cycle, converting it first to nitrite, then to nitrate, the most bioavailable form of nitrogen for plant roots. What Marin was pumping onto her fields when she opened the head gates was not irrigation water. It was a living solution carrying nitrogen, phosphorus, trace minerals, and billions of beneficial microorganisms that hadn't existed in that soil for the better part of a decade. She wasn't adding fertilizer. She was reintroducing the conditions under which the soil could feed itself. Her grandmother had seen the beginning of this, sketched its outline in a composition notebook, and hadn't had the specific language to complete the thought. Marin had the language. She just needed the courage to trust it. The first full growing season was hard in the way that honest work is hard, not dramatic, not crisis-ridden, just relentless. She planted a cover crop of winter rye and crimson clover in November, not for harvest but for soil structure, to put organic matter back into the ground and give the emerging microbial life something to work with. She monitored the ditch water twice a week, testing pH, measuring dissolved oxygen, watching the fish population. When spring came, she planted a modest 6 acres of market garden vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans. She wasn't ready for commodity crops. She knew it. She was working the biological system back into function before she asked it to perform. In May, she found the first earthworm. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Earthworms do not appear in dead soil. They are a downstream indicator of microbial health. Organisms that arrive only after the bacterial populations have sufficiently recovered to support them. She was kneeling at the edge of a bed she'd amended with compost and irrigated twice through the ditch system, and she pushed her hand into the soil and felt the unmistakable give of something alive and moving. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and stayed there for a while. She sent a soil sample to the state agricultural lab at the end of the first growing season. The results came back in 3 weeks. Organic matter had climbed from 0.8% to 1.4%. Microbial biomass, a measure of the living weight of bacteria and fungi per gram of soil, had more than doubled. The lab technician who reviewed the report added a handwritten note in the margin, which Marin found remarkable given that no one adds handwritten notes to soil reports. Unusual rate of biological recovery. What amended inputs are you using? She wrote back, fish. The second year, she expanded to 18 acres of market crops and added a small grain plot. Her yields weren't record-breaking. They weren't supposed to be. But her costs were minimal. She'd spent almost nothing on external inputs, and she was running a small profit by August. More importantly, the soil was changing in ways she could feel before she could measure. It was darker. It held moisture longer after irrigation. When she crumbled it between her fingers, it had a structure to it. Aggregates, the tiny clumps that healthy soil forms when its microbial life produces the right binding compounds. It smelled like earth again, that particular clean, complex scent that meant something was living in it. Then came the third summer. A drought settled over most of the county in late June and stayed through August. It was the kind of dry that split the road shoulders and turned the grass along the highway to straw. Mr. Hendricks, whose soybeans had been looking strong through June, began irrigating heavily in July. He pumped water from his pond directly onto his fields. For a few weeks it seemed to work. The beans stayed green, but his soil, saturated with years of synthetic inputs, had lost its structure. The water ran off the surface faster than it could be absorbed. The salt buildup from fertilizer applications had reduced the soil's capacity to hold moisture against its own particles. He was watering more to achieve less, and by mid-August it was showing. The beans on the east side of his property started going yellow. Marin's field stayed green. not spectacularly green, not the green of a TV commercial, but a steady, quiet green. The kind that comes from plants drawing moisture from soil that actually holds it. The revitalized organic matter in her fields acted the way it was designed to act, like a sponge absorbing water during irrigation and releasing it slowly into the root zone over days. Her plants had deeper root systems than their neighbors because healthy soil with good structure allows roots to penetrate further. They were reaching moisture that the surface wasn't showing. When harvest came in September, Maren brought her numbers to the farmers market co-op meeting, as she always did. Yield per acre, water used, input costs. She laid them on the table without comment. Mr. Hendricks looked at them for a long time. He didn't say anything that evening. But 2 days later, he came by the farm on foot, which was unusual, and stood at the edge of her south field where the soil was darkest and crumbled a handful of it in his palm without being invited to. He let it fall through his fingers. He looked at it. "How long does it take?" he said, more to himself than to her. She told him what she'd told herself in the beginning. It takes as long as it takes, and then it goes faster than you expect. It was 4 years after that drought, 6 years after Maren had released 300 juvenile tilapia into a stagnant ditch on a failing farm, that a man named Mr. Sorensen came to see her. He was a regional director for a biological agriculture consulting firm that had been growing rapidly as more farmers began looking for alternatives to the synthetic input model. He had driven 3 hours. He was wearing clean boots, which she respected. He had a folder of documents and a manner that suggested he was accustomed to being taken seriously, but he held it without arrogance. He told her he had seen her soil test data, which had been cited without her name in a university extension paper. He had asked around until he found out where the data came from. He had driven here, he said, because what her land had done in 6 years was not supposed to be possible at that speed, not without significant purchased inputs. The rate of biological recovery in her soil profile was, according to the researchers he worked with, anomalous. He wanted to know if she would consider partnering with his firm. They would send a soil science team to document her system. They would develop it into a replicable model, a consulting protocol they could offer to degraded farmland operations nationally. She would receive a licensing fee, a percentage of consulting revenue, and she would be credited as the originator of the system. He named a number. It was a large number. Maren poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. She asked him a question before she answered. "When your firm takes a system like this to another farm," she said, "how do you teach it?" He said they would document the protocols, the species selection, the ditch design, the planting ratios. They would create a step-by-step implementation guide. And when the farmer follows the guide, she said, and something doesn't work, something that isn't in the guide, what do they do? He said they would call the consulting team. She looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Sorensen," she said, "the reason this worked is that I paid attention to this specific piece of land for 6 years. Every time something didn't work, I didn't call anyone. I looked at what the land was telling me. What you're describing is taking that attention and replacing it with a manual. A manual isn't what did this." He was quiet. She was not unkind about it. She told him she would be happy to have his soil science team visit. She would share her data, her notebooks, her methods. She would do a recorded interview. She would do a field walk. All of that was available to him freely because the knowledge didn't belong to her. It belonged to the land, and what the land had taught her could be shared without being sold. But she would not license it. She would not allow it to be turned into a product, because the moment it became a product, it would stop being what it actually was, a practice of paying attention. He sat with that for a while. He was a smart man, He understood what she was saying even if his business model had no column for it. He thanked her, finished his coffee, and drove 3 hours back to wherever he'd come from. That fall, Mr. Hendricks converted 6 acres along his eastern fence line to her system. He dug the weirs himself, badly at first, then better. He bought a small load of juvenile tilapia from the same farm she'd used. He called her twice with questions. She answered both times. She walked the fence line with him on a Saturday morning in November and showed him where to plant the sedge and why the bank angle mattered for the root colonization. He didn't say thank you with words. He showed up at her place the following week with a tractor and spent an afternoon grading the access road that ran along her south field, which had been rutted since spring. When he was done, he just waved and drove home. That was enough. In the years that followed, the Voss farm grew, not dramatically, not through acquisition or expansion for its own sake, but because 2 neighboring parcels came available when their owners, caught in the familiar spiral of input costs and shrinking margins, made the practical decision to sell rather than go under. Maren bought the first with the farm's own earnings. She bought the second with the help of a small USDA loan she repaid in 3 years. Each parcel took time. The soil on both was compromised in different ways. One from chemical overuse, one from neglect, and she worked them back the same way she'd worked her grandmother's land, with water and fish and sedge grass and patience and her own 2 hands in the dirt every morning. Her grandmother's composition notebooks lived on the roll-top desk in the front room. Next to them, over the years, Maren had stacked her own. 7 of them now, filled with observations in the same careful, unhurried way that Iris had filled hers. Water temperatures, fish counts, soil color changes. The date the red-tailed hawks came back, which happened in the spring of the 4th year, a pair of them nesting in the same old oak at the property's edge, where her grandmother had shown her one as a child. She made a note of it in the margin, the way her grandmother would have. A farm with hawks is a farm with balance. She also wrote, underneath it, the hawks didn't come back because I called them. They came back because the land was ready for them. There is a version of Maren Voss's story that the people who laugh at unconventional ideas prefer to tell. The lucky one, the fluke, the person who caught the right conditions at the right time and called it a method. There is another version, the one you know now, in which a young woman inherited a failing farm and a set of notebooks written by someone who had spent a lifetime paying attention, and she trusted that attention over every credential and every brochure and every well-meaning person who told her that the soil was too far gone. The soil was not too far gone. It was waiting. And that is the thing about depleted land, and maybe about depleted people too. What looks like death from the outside is sometimes just dormancy. The system isn't broken, it's hungry, and if you're patient enough and honest enough and willing to put your ear close enough to the ground to actually listen, it will tell you exactly what it needs.